Hello, thank you for joining us. I'm Jonathan Dunsky, author of the Adam Lapid series, and today I have the honor and privilege of interviewing Pamela Cohen, author of Hidden Heroes, One Woman's Story of Resistance and Rescue in the Soviet Union. Pamela, thank you for joining me tonight.
Oh my gosh, it's my privilege. So happy to be with you.
I mean, for me, it's a distinct pleasure because no, I've never had the chance to meet a person like you who has done such a momentous thing as what you described in the book, and we'll talk about it more. Uh, I mean, and it's one of the great benefits of being a writer myself, because this is the way we found each other. You actually read one of my novels, or maybe more of them, and you wrote to me and then said, "I've written this book about my," and you were very modest about it, about my activities in the movement to rescue Refuseniks, and here in Israel we used to call them prisoners of Zion, from the Soviet Union, Jews who wanted to immigrate from the Soviet Union and were forbidden to. And I thought, okay. The first thought actually that came into my mind when I read your email about your book was that I remember that when I was a child in the 1980s, uh, this was a huge story in Israel, all the Refuseniks. This was major news. It was on the news all the time. And whenever someone managed to get out and come to Israel, it was a huge event. And then it was something that I haven't thought about in at least 20, maybe 30 years. And I sort of started asking myself why that was. And do you have an answer to that, as to why that particular story seems to have, fallen by the wayside of history in a way? At least, we don't talk about it as much as we talk even about certain things that happened much earlier in Jewish history, like, for instance, the expulsion of Jews from Spain. This is something we talk about 500 years after the fact. And this, the Refusenik movement, something that affected hundreds of thousands of Jews, maybe millions of Jews in the Soviet Union, seems to have come and gone, at least in the things
You
that
know,
people
I,
talk about.
I think it's like the Holocaust. I think it's like, in a way, it took a number of years, maybe even a decade, until the world started looking at the Holocaust and started. I mean, one of the reasons how I got involved in the movement was because I grew up before you did. I was born during the Holocaust. And by the time I was 16, 17 years old, so it was, 17 years later when books started being written about the Holocaust. Um, and I questioned. I mean, I identified with someone like that, Adam Lapid, your character, who lost his wife and children in Auschwitz. And I couldn't understand how I understood how Europeans let it happen. I mean, somehow, even from a 17-year-old brain, I could figure that's possible, but I couldn't figure out how Americans would let that happen. And there was a kind of silence afterwards for like 17 years. And I think it's very similar. I think now the stories are beginning to emerge about what really happened in the Soviet Union. And people are beginning to recognize that, well, the Soviet Aliyah was not like the French or the American and South American Aliyah, the British Aliyah, that it was a really distinct movement. And I think that the stories are being captured in films like Refuseniks by Laura Vialli, and books by various Refuseniks and mine that are starting to come to the fore. People are beginning to really look at this movement for the first time.
And when first of all, before we talk about the movement itself, let's talk about the situation of Jews in the Soviet Union in the 1970s, which I believe is when you became involved in the movement, and also when sort of it started, I think, after the Six-Day War, when there was sort of resurgence of Jewish identity in within the Soviet Union. But you'll be able to talk about that more than I can. What was the situation like for Jews in the Soviet Union, which was a police state, a communist state at the time.
Yeah. I mean, today, Jonathan, it's hard for people even to relate with social media and the instant gratification of telephones where you can call anywhere. What the isolation was for Soviet Jews. They were completely cut off, and starting from from the Russian Revolution, 1917, 1918, there was a cultural genocide, a religious genocide against Jews, against Jewish religion, and it certainly stepped up under Stalin. And Jews by by 1970, I would say that the seminal event was 67. Up until 67, Jews were really completely cut off from the rest of the world. I mean, Soviet Jews had no contact with American Jews. They knew nothing about Israel. Many Jews didn't realize that Israel was their homeland. They had no information about Jewish history. All the books had been purged. Maybe your Zadie had a sitter in his house, but there were no publications, no magazines, no history, no Jewish bookstores, no Jewish schools. Everything had been really Judenrein. And in 67, the Soviet propaganda, the Soviet national TV broadcasts the 67 war, in which they depicted Israeli soldiers abandoning their posts and fleeing, and they pictured the images that they showed the Soviet population was massive defeat by the Arabs over the Israelis. But Jews know how to read between the lines. And what Jews saw in the Soviet Union the first thing they saw were Jewish soldiers, Jews, proud Jews, fighting for a homeland, standing tall, willing to sacrifice their lives for a Jewish homeland. And even with the Soviet anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic propaganda, Jews walked out of those days, 6-day war, 3 inches taller than they were when they went into it. They began to be proud to be Jews, and they began to seek out what it meant to be a Jew and how to immigrate to Israel. And the second, if I may, the second major shift was 1970, as you said. After 3 years of trying to leave and setting up underground Hebrew classes in Leningrad and in Riga, a very small number of Jews decided that they were going to do what was actually a desperately conceived plan, Mesiras Nefesh, to try to hijack a plane from Leningrad to Sweden, knowing that they would never make it, knowing in advance, but knowing that they would be apprehended, sentenced to death, but that the news would penetrate the sealed news borders, media borders, and American Jews would understand that there were 3 to 5 million, if that's what we thought at the time, and even more, Soviet Jews in the Soviet Union that were completely isolated and locked in, not able to live as Jews, but not able to leave the country.
And we should also say that this wasn't a hijacking like we may imagine.
Correct.
This was something that, if I believe it was a very small airplane, it wasn't there weren't hundreds of innocent passengers on that. They brought their own pilot with them, I think, or someone who was able to fly the plane. Wasn't that part of the story?
Yeah, Mark Dimshitz was a pilot in the Air Force, and he was one of the people that were really ready to leave. And they planned to get onto the tarmac in Leningrad while the plane was empty. And if there was a pilot already on the plane, they were going to tie him up, leave him on the tarmac, take the plane to Sweden, leave the plane in Sweden, and then go on to Israel. It was, not the kind of a hijacking that we think. It was an
Yeah.
act of desperation. It was the only way that they could send up a flare to those of us in the United States that could see the flare and react and start to do something to be able to help them.
And they knew that their chances of success were next to none.
Yeah, they knew it was.
And they also knew the price could be their life. But this was the first major time in which the power of media sort of came into focus, even on the Soviet leadership at the time.
Correct. And I mean, I was a young mom with 3 little kids. And when I saw the news about Jewish hijackers in Leningrad, I knew something was wrong. Jews are not hijackers.
Okay.
And even though the American press wasn't clear about what happened, it really, I have to tell you, it took me months to be able to find a news source for what was happening in the Soviet Union. And I lived in Chicago at the time. And it wasn't until I was able to find a newspaper in Pennsylvania that published a weekly article about what was happening in the Soviet Union. And I began to learn the names of the hijackers and what was happening to Jews in the Soviet Union, and that they wanted publicity, and they wanted public support, and they wanted pressure against the Soviet embassy, and they wanted us to enlist our Congress, and they wanted to enlist the White House. And they wanted us to write letters because if you could write a letter with the tremendous amount of surveillance, I mean, there was postal surveillance by KGB, there were surveillance of telephone calls, but if you could, send a letter to the Soviet Union, it was a notification to KGB that Americans were watching. So
Okay.
it was, you're right. It was like, that was the first penetration of information to the West by Walter Cronkite and by news sources on the CBS and NBC News.
And as you said, you were a young mom. I suppose you had a lot of things on your plate. What drove you? Because in the book you describe the sort of dedication that really it took over your life in a way. This effort to help those people. What was this the event that made you sort of move into this sort of action?
Yes, when I saw that they were arresting Jews.
Hmm.
And then after the Leningrad trials, these two sets of trials that resulted from the hijacking, they started to go after any Jew who was learning Hebrew language. They started to do house searches, which is, I mean, if you could imagine, you have young kids, the knock on the door in the middle of the night, and uniformed KGB comes in and started ripping every book off the shelf and ripping out everything that you own and skimming through everything and throwing everything on the floor, terrorizing the families. There were house searches in Leningrad and Riga and Moscow. Anybody who was identified with a desire to immigrate to Israel had to withstand tremendous pressure from KGB. And when I saw that, I mean, and the information, we started to develop this information network, and the information started to trickle in. I felt really like I had felt from my teenage years that I really felt that my parents' generation were culpable in what happened in Europe in the Holocaust. I understand that there was anti-Semitism and they were afraid, and and I've done a lot of studying since then. And I felt, even as a young woman, that the silence of my parents' generation was a complicit signal to the Nazis that no one cared. And certainly our leadership in the United States, Rabbi Stephen Wise, as I did, investigation, I felt that they were complicit. And Jonathan, something in me, even though I was really young, had no experience, really was very super shy, did not want the publicity, didn't want the spotlight on me. Something inside me yelled, "Not on my watch."
I see.
No.
And you
And it
mentioned,
just
and you
took
mentioned
over.
that you said that the Jews in the Soviet Union faced cultural and religious genocide and I was not aware of this. I knew that Stalin, shortly before he died, he had a sort of plan to move the Jews, to put them aside in somewhere in Siberia or in some of the
Azerbaijan.
most inhospitable parts of the Soviet Union. And he died before he managed to carry that plan out. But it seemed from your book that Jews in the Soviet Union were this close to actually stopping being Jews and getting to a point in which no one would be able to even pull them back into the fold of Judaism. That all the customs and the language and the prayers and even the connections were frayed and on the verge of being,
Correct.
severed completely. And this
Correct.
was this was this was something that the Soviet authorities did, and they were adamant that they would complete this.
Correct. It was a targeted policy to forcibly assimilate the Jews. And look, I've learned to understand it. I've talked to so many people who came from the Soviet Union. And everyone has told me that if you wanted to, and if you read Sharansky's book, Never Alone, in which he describes what it was to grow up in Donetsk. And he talks about the anti-Semitism it reminds me very much of what's happening in America today, but that's another story. It was subtle. It was anti-Israel. It was anti-Zionist. But if you wanted to join the best chess club, or if you wanted to get into the best school, or if you wanted to be accepted, you had to be better. If you were a Jew with a Jewish name and a Jewish face, or Jew, you were in your internal papers. There was a line was line 5, in which you were supposed to state your nationality. If you were from one of the Central Asian states, if you're from Latvia, if you were Lithuania, wherever you were. But if you were a Jew, you had to put Yivri.
I see.
And
Okay.
and many Jews who wanted their children to go into the best schools, they didn't put Ivre on their flying 5 passport, internal passport. So people were on a track to succeed. And even though they had to be better than everybody else, that was the track that they were on. And the idea for many of the parents was, after 1970, keep your head down. Don't make waves. Just get the best grades you can get and get into the best school you can get in. And we'll provide all kinds of tutors so that you can be, much better than anybody else. And that's what it looked like in 1970. And you're absolutely right. There was nothing. There was no, as I said, no contact with America, no contact with Israel, no contact with anywhere in the West, no history. No Jewish history. People didn't know what happened in Israel. They didn't know any of their own history. Maybe they had, as I said, an Alta Zaidi that could remember something. And I've heard stories about that. But otherwise, it had really, up until that point, it was really almost Judenrein, culturally Judenrein.
Okay, so after the hijacking of the plane and then the Leningrad trials, how did you become part of that movement? Because the movement was already, in some shape or form, there were already organizations which have started taking this on this mission. How did you become involved in Chicago?
Okay, so as I said, it took me a couple of years to find out what was happening in the Soviet Union, and once I did, I understood that the best thing you could do was to involve your congressman and send letters to the prisoners of Zion, the people who were arrested, and simultaneously, there were people in the Soviet Union who saw the Leningrad trials and the 67 war as a wake-up call. They saw it as the fact that they had a chance of being proud Jews.
Mhm.
And so they also began surreptitiously to work underground to find people who, would learn Aleph Melim, like one word of Hebrew at a time.
Let's see.
And they started a program of tarbut, of cultural awakening underground, especially in Riga and Leningrad. And Jews started applying for permission. Of course, there was no mechanism to even though there was supposed to be freedom of immigration and reunification of families, there was no real mechanism in place to immigrate. And the Soviet mechanism was designed actually to discourage immigration. And so anyone who tried to apply was refused. So on one hand, more people were applying every year after 70. And on our side, and being refused. And on our side, people like me started, my first activity was to put together a group of young moms who would write letters to Refuseniks and write letters to our congressman and write letters to the president. And by the time 1978 came around, or 1976, someone told me, there isn't a group in Chicago called Chicago Action for Soviet Jewry.
Yeah.
And they were grassroots doing the same thing, but in much more organized. And I made contact with them and got the equivalent of a, PhD in Soviet studies from Laurel Pollack, who was the chairman, and really sharp and really understood US-Soviet relations and Israel-Soviet non-relations, because at that time they didn't have,
Diplomatic relations.
but the whole issue of how Soviet Jewry played in this multinational relations. And by 1978, she retired and I became chairman of Chicago Action for Soviet Jewry. And then in 1986 became the national president of the Union of Councils, which was a national organization made up of grassroots, maybe like 48, I think, at some point 52 grassroots organization across the country, mostly all volunteers, a lot of very, very strong women and students.
Okay.
When Sharansky was in interrogation and he was before his trial and he was allowed to see like thousands of pages of documentation from the prosecution, one of the things he was allowed to see was a video of his wife Avital leading a grassroots demonstration and on his behalf. And he kept asking the interrogator to see it over and over because he was seeing his wife for the first time since she was forced to immigrate in 1974. And the interrogator said, you think people care about you? Nobody cares about you. It's just housewives and students. So that's basically, that was the bulk of the movement.
You mentioned Sharansky, and I was planning on asking you, to tell us about some of the Refuseniks. There were many, but a few names became more well known, and I think Sharansky was the most well known of the lot. What made Nathan Sharansky so well known, such a household name in Israel to this day?
Okay, So
What was special about his story?
okay, I'm going to tell you what the story is, but when I was asked to write my Refuseniks asked me to write my book for many, many years. They wanted me to write it. And one of the reasons they wanted me to write it was because they knew that I was going to tell the unvarnished story of Soviet Jews.
Yeah.
And today, retrospectively, we look at Soviet Jewry movement and we think it was, oh, let my people go, and it was unified voices. It was at that time far from the truth. There were many points of view, and there were, in a way, although we were all discussing Soviet Jewry, they had various interests. And the Sharansky case at the very beginning was very controversial because Sharansky was working with Andrei Sakharov. The academician, Andrei Sakharov, was not Jewish. He was a human rights activist who brought together all the parts of the human rights movement. And Natan spoke beautiful English, and he had a great sense of humor. And he was the spokesman for the Jewish movement among the dissidents. He was the non-Jewish dissidents, and he was coordinating the Jewish movement as part of the wider human rights movement. And that was a very controversial issue for the Israeli government and for the Jewish establishment that wanted Rak Aliyah.
Only immigration to Israel.
Only immigration to Israel.
Yeah.
And they were concerned that bringing the Jewish movement within the context of the dissident movement could jeopardize the Jewish movement.
I see.
They felt that the dissident movement, which included the democratic movement that was looking for democracy and the rights of the individual republics, they felt that it could damage the Jewish movement and put the Jewish movement under increasing pressure. And so he was at the beginning very controversial. Really, I tell you what made him was that the president of the Union of Councils, Irene Manikovsky, was very close to Avital, and Natan understood who the union was and told people who had visited him before his arrest that they should work with the Union of Councils, with the grassroots movement. And Avital came to Washington in 1974, and she was working with the union. And when Natan was given his sentence, he was in Washington with Irene Manikovsky, who was our president. And from then on, the union just really, really made that case the most prominent case that we possibly could. He was accused of being a traitor. He's a spy. And we really, it took time, but we marshaled the Congress and we marshaled the State Department and ultimately the White House to come to his defense. But, retrospectively, we look at him from this period of time when he became this prominent symbol of the Soviet Jewry movement. But those of us who were involved in the movement, we remember a time when we felt that we had to make him that symbol.
You needed to make the general into the personal in a way.
Yes, yes, and our organization, we took our cues from Soviet Jews, and if he felt that working with Sakharov and working with the dissidents was part of a way to combat the anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union, to make it part of the mechanism to recognize basic human rights, the right to immigrate and the right to return became a very, very big platform of Sakharov, and that was very helpful for Jews. But there were ups and there were downs in the whole immigration movement, and ultimately it was a battle that it was a war that we won and battles we lost.
I see.
You
And of
know,
course, people paid a heavy price. Sharansky and others spent years in the sort of jails that no one can imagine, and they were either internally exiled and then imprisoned in terrible conditions. In
I
what
mean,
was
one of the you asked about paradigms of the movement, and one of them was Josef Mendeleevic.
Now, I was going to ask you about him. This is another main character who's also well known in Israel to this day.
Name. I mean, and he, what we took from people like Mendeleevic and Sharansky were what was communicated to us in the West was a sense of tremendous moral courage
Mhm.
to be Jewish. What it meant to stand up against the forces of evil, to stand up against forces that want to cut you down. For Sharansky to stand up and fight the social pressures of not, I mean, the man was brilliant. He could have gotten into almost any place he wanted, even as a Jew, but he stood up for what he believed. He couldn't buy into the system anymore. And he stood up and applied to emigrate. Josef came to it through a little different way. He was not a religious Jew. He was as assimilated as everybody else in Riga, he knew who he was, but he started going to the site of the Holocaust site where Jews were just gunned down in Riga.
Okay.
And the bones were starting to come to the surface.
Mhm.
And young Jews would go into the forest, Rambuli, and they would bury the bones. And little by little, his sense of what it meant to become a Jew became very important to him. And when we saw the things that he was doing inside, ultimately, he was also arrested. He was arrested as part of the Leningrad trial
Yeah.
defendants. And when we saw how he was trying to live an observant life in a prison cell, and deprived of visits for his family because he wanted to wear a kippah,
Mhm.
or saving a few raisins that he got so that he could make wine for Pesach, saving these few raisins and depriving himself of all kinds of things. I mean, one of the stories that really touched me was that on Fridays, he scratched in the prison wall pictures, an image of candles.
Oh, wow.
And he would bless the candles and from his prison cell. And it was a huge message to us in the United States of what it meant and the price people were willing to pay to live Jewish lives and to live in Israel.
And as part of that movement, we should tell our viewers that this was not, you weren't only working in the United States, you were actually traveling to the Soviet Union to meet with these people in person. And I thought, when I read it, I was actually quite surprised because I thought that you were taking a personal risk. But did you feel that you were taking a personal risk going into that country?
Well, the first time we went in 1978, Lenny and I, my husband and I, went to 5 cities, and I did not feel threatened, although we had incidences that,
Mhm.
Might have been interpreted as threats, but we were fine. And then I didn't apply for a visa for 10 years, because I had now at this point been very much in touch with Refuseniks by telephone and mail, and had developed an underground system of calling them. And I've been written about as an anti-Zionist and as an anti-Soviet Zionist in the papers. And I was afraid if I would go, I could implicate the people that I was visiting, the Refuseniks I was visiting. So I didn't go until for 10 years later, at which time President Reagan was coming to the Soviet Union for a summit. And we worked with the State Department to be part of that delegation, so that it would give us some kind of protexia. which is a story, as you know, in the book itself, that they denied our visas, and it wasn't until the military chief of staff, Colin Powell, intervened on our behalf. We got our visas when we were in Helsinki, but only one time. I was in the Soviet Union many times, and what I was doing there was, why I wanted to go was because this wasn't a matter of doing chesed, although I knew that, redeeming the campus, redeeming the captain is a mitzvah. It was a question of partnership. It was a question of creating a partnership between Soviet Jews that was not paternalistic, but that was real partnership, that we were their voice. And in order to know what they wanted and how we had to conduct the public program and the diplomatic program and the political program, how they wanted us to conduct the campaign, I really had to go and meet the leadership. There was only one time I was nervous. I don't remember what year it was, but I remember packing and saying to my husband, "What am I doing? I have 3 little kids. They know who I am. And what am I doing?" And I remember clearly my husband very quietly said, "You'll be fine. You'll have to go."
But in the book, it's evident that this was a massive organization, and you had lists of American Jews that were willing to go, and you gave them briefings, where to go, who to speak to, who not to speak to. They took things with them that the Refuseniks could barter in the Soviet Union, because it was a poor communist country, so they could barter Western products and supplies. And this actually was something that even took place with Jews from outside the United States. When I told my father that I was going to be interviewing you, he said, "Your uncle, he traveled from Sweden to the Soviet Union a couple of times to meet with those guys." And this was the first time I heard about it. My uncle immigrated to Sweden decades ago, and my dad just came out and said, he and your aunt, they went to the Soviet Union a few times to deliver stuff and meet with Refuseniks. And my uncle and aunt are not the sort of people that I envision going on such a mission. And this struck a chord with me in your book as well, that ordinary people just were willing to take on something that's quite scary. Just going into the Soviet Union on something that's not exactly clandestine, but it's not approved by the Soviet authorities. They would frown upon you doing it, meeting with these people, taking messages to and from them. I was quite impressed by how many people were involved and the level of organization required to conduct such an operation across so many.
That's how we built the movement.
Yeah.
So we built the movement that by sending people. One of my favorite stories is that there was a young attorney in Chicago who was very bright and really caught on. Right when after I came back from the Soviet Union in '78, his first thing was, "What can I do?" And ultimately, we sent him to the Soviet Union. I said to my partner, Marilyn Tallman, at the time, "We're paying for this." And we were grassroots. We had no money. We had to raise our own funds. We weren't funded by anybody. I said, "We're going to send him to the Soviet Union. It will come back to us many times." And of course, he went to the Soviet Union, and people came back like we were, on fire. And they talked about it. People come up to me today, Jonathan, and I met a woman today in the streets who read my book, and she said, "I went to the Soviet Union 3 times, and it was the best thing we ever did in our lives." And people say that to me all the time. Those that they went, they met Jews who were, I call them hidden heroes, because we aren't used to seeing, in Israel you are, because you have the army and you have people who are going into the army and standing up against formidable enemies and who are taking, tremendous risk and who are trained and who have the pride to do it. But I have to tell you, in the rest of the world, we don't have that. We don't have people, we don't have heroes, we don't have people to emulate. I mean, maybe a kid has a basketball hero, that's like a big deal. But they in America, they were meeting people with tremendous moral courage who put their lives on the line. They didn't know whether they were going to get permission. I mean, once the process, I'm just going to just tell you that, and your listeners, I mean, the process of applying was harrowing. Because if you were, say, a scientist, many Jews were scientists working in various industries and factories and institutions, and the first thing you had to do was to get an invitation, a visa from Israel, in which everything had to be perfect. The way you spelled your name, your birthday, your children's names, everything had to be perfect. It had to come from by mail. It had to be stamped. So the Soviets could stop it easily at the border. And many times people were waiting for visas for years until they could get one. And then they had to take it for, to be approved. And then they gave you a list of people you needed to have sign off. First of all, was the head of your institution. Now you're applying for immigration to the state of Israel, which is considered the
enemy camp.
The enemy camp. Yeah. And you are a fifth column in the Soviet Union. And so you are fired from your job. You are defrocked of all your honors. You are called to a meeting of all your colleagues where you were quite respected, and they defame you publicly. And you are no longer having a salary. You are no having an income. You have to take it to your apartment manager, the head of your apartment. They are also see you as a pariah. Your kids have to take it to the school. You have to get signed off from your family, your parents. If your father is in the Communist Party and he has a good job, or even if he has not a member of the Communist Party, and has a good job, he doesn't want to sign. So you can't get these signatures. Applying was just extremely extreme. It made you an immediate social, political, economic pariah, and you hadn't even been refused permission yet.
I see.
Once you were refused permission, which most Jews were, you didn't know how long your term of refusal could be. Yuli Kasharovsky was in refusal for 17 years. You know what? I mean, you eat your drapes, you sell your table, you sell any possessions you had in order to live. And, when we brought in hard goods for them to sell, it wasn't that, it was to sustain them and to sustain the movement. So what the tourists did were incredible, because they came back and they also involved their congressman, and they also sent letters to the State Department and the Soviet embassy, and little by little, through the programs that we established like an adoptive family program. So we would get synagogues to adopt a Refusenik family, or even like the American Physical Society to adopt a Refusenik physicist, and the American Psychiatric Society to adopt a Refusenik who had been sent for psychiatric abuse in an institution. And these synagogues also, at the grassroots level, contacted their congressman, sending, 150 postcards with Zachar Sunshine's picture, free Zachar. And then we call and say, look, we want to make this a top priority. Then the Congress did make it a top priority, and they took it to the State Department along with us, backed us at the State Department. And ultimately, we had the administrations fighting this battle for us.
And well, you were a grassroots movement going against an empire that stretched from East Germany all the way to across Asia, to the Bering Straits. What gave you the belief or the faith that you would that you could beat them?
You know what? We didn't. People would say to me all the time, they would say, who are you? I was a little girl. I mean, I was like 30 something years old.
Mm.
And who do you think you are, taking on the vast weight of the Soviet Empire? And we didn't expect what happened to happen. Our goal was to take out one Jew at a time.
Mhm.
Every Jew, I mean, we knew the names of every refusenik who wanted publicity. We knew their birth dates. We know the last time they were refused permission. They knew their names of their children. We knew when their children were, I remember Emma Lansman, when she had a child that died and broke our hearts while he was in refusal. We knew the stories of Boris Chernobilski, who wouldn't let his children go to a Soviet school that was struggling to get him into an international school because he was really an Israeli citizen in
Mhm.
absentia. They took on, they wanted to be treated like Israeli citizens in Moscow. I mean, we saw people with such incredible moral courage, and it inspired us.
Mhm.
It changed our lives. They
I know that
changed
it changed your life fundamentally. You talked about this in the book, that similarly to how uh, Jews in the Soviet Union found their Judaism and their faith and began to adhere to various religious customs and edicts. You yourself went through a journey of faith in a way.
There were two things. First of all, um, my husband and I were not observant when this started. I mean, we were
Mhm.
very identified, obviously, to do this, but little by little, their journey impacted us. And I'll give you one example. There was a refusenik by the name of Mariasin, who wrote a letter to one of our synagogues who had adopted him. And he wrote in this letter something that I never forgot. He told the story of Jews being transported in a cattle car
Mm.
to Auschwitz. And he told the story of someone saying, what are we going to do? It's Simchas Torah, and we don't have a Sefer Torah. And he said, we're going to take a child and we're going to hold him up and we're going to dance around him. And Jonathan, I was in Deerfield, Illinois, and I said, Simchas Torah? We don't even know what Simchas Torah is.
Mhm.
We in my community, a very big Jewish community, didn't know what Simchas Torah is. And he was telling a story about the emunah and the faith and the courage of Jews on their way to Auschwitz. And of course, that reflected on those of us who were in the movement. Their desire to be not only um, in the mainstream of Judaism, and to find their quest for their identity became my quest for my identity, and to find really what Judaism was, and to grasp on to the privilege of being able to live in Israel. I mean,
Mhm.
people who were sacrificing, 15 years of their freedom for the right to live in Israel. I remember standing in line at the Museum of the Diaspora in Tel Aviv after Hillel Bootman, after everybody from the Leningrad trials was released.
Mhm.
And I was at a meeting for Soviet Jewry, for the Union of Councils, and I was in line at the museum, and right in front of me was Hillel Bootman, who was arrested and sentenced to 15 years of prison, who was arrested and released early in 1978. He was released, and there he was in line. And I literally burst into tears.
Mhm.
Hillel Bootman paid for his right to come to Israel and to be in Israel with a one-way ticket, never going back to see his parents, not taking anything with him, with one suitcase at the most. And I, Pamela Cohen, all I have to do, I could buy a two-way ticket. I can take a bank account. I could go back and see my parents. I mean, I was so struck by the Mesiras Nefesh of these people that it affected us,
I see. I see
and
what
not
you mean.
only us.
Let's talk. Let's talk about another famous Refusenik, Ida Noodle, who who was also someone who was very well known here in Israel, and she was a very special person within the movement of Refuseniks within the Soviet Union. What can you tell us about her and what made her special?
Ida Nudell was refused permission early in the 70s, and what she did was she became the angel of the prisoners. As Jews, and at that one time, we had well over 27 Jewish boys who had been sent to prison or hard labor camps for the right, just for immigrating. And she adopted them. She took care of their families.
Mhm.
She made sure that she fought for them to get, they had the right to get a package twice a year. And this package, they could get long underwear. I mean, I can remember they could get Earl Grey tea, they could get vitamins, and white chocolate. And of course, every one of our tourists sent in all the things that they could get, and she would package them and send them to the Refuseniks. And if they did get delivered, she would fight the Soviet authorities to make sure that they were delivered. She would go and visit them. She sustained them. She gave them hope, and she was the spokesman for them, for us. So we knew what was happening to Chomyansky. We knew what was happening to Yuli Edelstein, your head speaker of the Knesset, when he was 3 years in prison. We knew because she had information from their families, and she broadcast it to the West. She was a remarkable woman and an extraordinarily strong woman. And she had a team of people that were working under her, who would, when our tourists brought in the hard goods like Nikon cameras that we bought for $500 a piece, I remember and she would need people on her team who would hold it in their houses, which was very dangerous to be able to even have something like it in case there was a house search, and then have the temerity and the courage to be able to sell it on the black market. And those funds would go to support the prisoners' families. These boys were in prison, their fathers were in prison. Yuli Edelstein, Ari Volvovsky, Vladimir Brodsky, these were all people who were heads of families, and their families had nothing. So they needed support from the West. If somebody like Tanya Zunshine wanted to see her husband in Irkutsk, which was in,
All the way
all
east.
the end of the end of the continent, she needed to take either a plane and trains, and she needed someone to go with her. Who pays for that? So, she organized that, and we supported them with literally, somebody once asked me how much, in terms of how much hard goods over the years that we sent in. And it was probably well over $1 million worth of hard goods and medicine that we had sent in with our tourists in order to support the movement.
And she was also arrested, if I recall, from
And then
your book. She was in a prison camp with men.
Yes, she was. She was sent into exile.
Internal exile, we should say. I mean, everything was within the Soviet Union. So.
Yes, it was within, but it was in Siberia, and it was horrible because she was sent into a labor camp. So this labor camp she was the only woman, and who goes there? I mean, they were criminals. They were drunks. They were people who were basically drinking lighter fluid because it was,
the only thing they had.
And someone smuggled in a knife for her. She slept with a knife under her pillow.
Yeah, I remember that from your book. Yeah, it's quite amazing the things that people were willing to go through for the right to emigrate.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, because in your book you alluded to this earlier, that this wasn't a cohesive movement. There were there were people with different attitudes or different motivations, and you were actually quite critical even of the Israeli government at times. Tell us why do you think that the Israeli authorities or the Israeli Foreign Service had a different attitude than you and your
Okay, I think there were two. I think there were two overriding issues.
okay.
I think one was the philosophical issue, which we would agree with theoretically, and that was there is no thing as a Jewish refugee when we have the state of Israel.
I agree as well. Yeah.
And I mean, theoretically, I agree with that. And I don't think anybody in our movement would have taken exception to that. But it was more complicated than that because they also, the Israeli government, at the time, it wasn't really the government. The issue of Soviet Jews was handled in what was like a secret office that was started by the Mossad early on, and they dealt with the whole issue of Soviet Jewry. And when we met with Begin in the 70s, he said when we were complaining about the way this office was handling Soviet Jewry and the way they were related to the rest of American Jews, they said, we trust them, we trust them, we trust them. One of the issues was that they believed that the issue of Soviet Jewry should be a component of Israel-Soviet affairs. Now, at that time, the Soviet Union was supplying the Arab client states with all kinds of guns and armaments. And they were training Palestinians in Moscow. We saw it. Israel was not in the strongest position to negotiate with the Soviets when they were dealing with the Soviets on national security issues. And we believed that Israel should deal with the Soviets first on national security, that was paramount for them. And even though they didn't have relations with the Soviet Union at that time, KGB and Mossad and everyone
knew how
everyone,
to. Yeah, they knew how to.
Our philosophy was, we're strong. The Jewish people are strong. Let the state of Israel and the Lishkat HaKesher work with fight with for national security. That's primary. Let's not sacrifice Soviet Jews in that mix. American Jews can fight for Soviet Jews.
I see.
America is in a much stronger position with bilateral relations with the Soviets and with Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which was passed in 1974, that tied immigration to economic benefits. So
this was one of the levers that you used to force the Soviets to ease some of the restrictions.
So we saw it as bifurcation is strength.
I see.
And we said to them, we'll help you. I met with them and I said, we will help you. Give us the materials. We're living in America and we're not living in Israel, but we can send information on housing. We can send information on Aliyah. We can send information on jobs. We can send, any kind of Zionist information you want. Give us the material. Our tourists will send them. We will send it. You build a Zionist movement. We'll help you. And there was no we didn't receive any cooperation
because they were worried about, their main focus was about getting the Soviets to give the Arab countries surrounding Israel less armaments, as few armaments as possible.
And maybe their point was Shah still. Let's not make Soviet Jewry a big deal because it'll interfere with our relations with the Soviet Union. And so their position with us was also Shah still. Don't go on demonstrations. Don't make a lot of noise. I mean, it became very complicated. And the other issue for us in America was because many of us came to this movement because of the complicity of the West on the Holocaust. We could not legitimately encourage America to close its doors to immigration. Yes, Israel was the homeland. Yes, the issue of there are no theoretical refugees, Jewish refugees anymore. But we could not legitimately and honestly and ethically stand by and have the America close the doors as they did for the St. Louis, the ship, the St. Louis, that they sent there.
So if a Russian Jew wished to immigrate to the United States, you would help him. You
Yes.
helped him the same way
Yes.
as someone who wanted to come
Yes.
to Israel.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that became very contentious for not just
I can imagine.
not only the Israeli government, but the entire Jewish establishment, which spoke in America, which spoke on behalf of the Israeli government. And so we were always treated rather contemptuously. And we had to create our own legitimacy and create our own stature with mostly with the American government. I mean, I met with two presidents. I met with Condi Rice, secretaries of state. I mean, people really had in America, we established a great deal of credibility, even though we were constantly being undermined by the establishment. And I just want you to know, Jonathan, we never took a public stand against the Israeli government. Even though we knew they were behind the establishment's position, we were very, very cautious, no matter what was happening, never to create a feeling that there was any kind of divisiveness between Jews and the state of Israel. So we kept a very low profile. We had plenty to do without fighting that battle.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, people who should read this book because it's quite amazing the scope of the effort that you and your comrades took upon you, and it's quite amazing to see how you went against this evil giant, the Soviet Union, and were able to emerge triumphant, even though, of course, you lost, as you said, you lost many battles, but eventually you won the war.
You know what? One of the battles that we lost, by the way, I really believe is being played out today. And that is when America finally did concede to Israel's demand to close the doors to refugees.
Okay.
At the end of what year was that? At the end of the 80s.
When the Soviet Union collapsed, you mean? Or?
It was even before that. Maybe it was even,
Okay.
you know what, I'm terrible at remembering the dates. But it was when Reagan went out of office.
So it's 89 or something like that?
Yeah, it was even, yes.
88 or 89.
Yeah. So when the Americans closed the doors to refugees and only allowed first-degree families in, families with maybe one Jewish grandfather, maybe 15 people that had a great Jewish grandfather, Ukrainians and Russians, who were basically no longer identified Jews, or not even Jews, could not come to the United States anymore. So they came to Israel. Okay. And when I came to a wedding here in my niece got married like in the early 80s, and there were a lot of people that I knew from the Soviet Jewry movement there. And they said, look what's coming now. Look what you're doing. You're bringing all these Russians and Ukrainians to Israel. And I said to them, that was not on our watch. That was done. We fought that tooth and nail. We did not want the United States doors closed. We felt, let Israel take in people who really wanted to be Israeli. Let the United States take in anybody else.
And what do you say? You said something, you mentioned things that are happening today, and I'm not sure our viewers are aware of the story. Something is happening today, which is reminiscent of things that happened during the Soviet Union, is that the Russian government now is on the verge of, or is threatening to kick out the Jewish agency
Correct.
from, or shutter it. Well, they're saying it's due to various legal issues, but it's apparently it's a political matter due to Israel's support of Ukraine, especially
Right.
Prime Minister's Lapid vociferous support of Ukraine, which apparently Vladimir Putin is not too crazy about. So, how do you feel about what's happening now with the Jewish agency in Russia? Do you feel? What do you think?
Well,
How do you
you know what?
analyze that?
Okay. It's exactly as you described. It's compensation. It's it's a kickback
Okay.
to fit the Israeli government for what
Retribution
they've
and
done.
all.
Yeah.
Okay.
But um those of us who really know Russia
Mm-hmm.
knew it was just a matter of time. I mean, I don't know. No, I don't know today how many Jews are left. I know I work with a few organizations that were doing work both in Ukraine and Belarus. I mean, there are still a lot of Jews in the Soviet Union. And for years, we were saying anybody who can leave should leave.
Mm-hmm.
This is, this is a moment of time. No one knows the future. The history of Russia, the history of the Soviet Union is ominous. It's just a matter of time. People should leave. And I don't know. I mean, I'm not a seer. I can't see what's going to be in the future, but certainly this is a warning. And it is definitely frightening people in the Jews in the Soviet Union, who are also have been very, very anxious ever since this war started,
Mm-hmm.
because many of them have been really under pressure to take a stand to support Putin.
Mm-hmm.
So it's difficult for Jews who have any kind of prominence in the Soviet Union and any of the Jewish organizations to like hide or to stay under the radar. In order to be able to survive, they have to support Putin, and many people feel just incapable of doing that, and they're leaving.
Yeah,
But I don't know what I don't know how this will play out. I don't know how this will play out in terms of the anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union coming from the government, blaming the Jews. It's always very tenuous. Jewish life there, life for Jews there is always tenuous. It's been that way for hundreds of years.
Mm-hmm. But at least now they're able to get on a plane and come, and there's a Jewish state that's ready to welcome them.
If the Jewish agency can function.
That's true, but people can still get on a plane by themselves. It's not as bad as it was
No,
when you were
correct,
fighting the Soviet Union.
correct.
I think on that, well, not exactly hopeful note, but somewhat positive note, um, um, we should conclude our conversation. I'd like to tell you that it's been an honor to learn about your story and your efforts and to read your book. And I think that anyone who's interested in learning how it's possible for just regular folks to create big change for the better should read Hidden Heroes, and you'll find, anyone who's watching, you'll find links in the description below to get the book. And I want to thank you for joining me tonight.
Oh,
It's a great
Jonathan,
honor.
you know what? As the creator of Adam Lapid, is really my honor. You know how I
No,
feel
I mean,
about
I write about fiction. I just make stuff
it.
up.
He's
You actually changed the world.
I have to tell you, that's one fictional character who's very real to me. I've told you.
Okay.
If I
Well,
see him on the
that's a
street,
topic
I'm
for another
afraid.
conversation.
Oh.
So until next time,
Thank you so much.
I'll just say that before I forget, anyone who wants to get notified of when I upload a new video, a new interview, please subscribe to the channel. And until next time, I'm Jonathan Dunsky, and thank you for watching.